Good evening, everyone. I'm so pleased you're all here. This is the fourth or third? No, because we did, oh, okay. All right, yes. Because we started with the book on the Constitution and, okay, Corey's book. Well, first of all, thank you so much. The second/third reading in our symposium series, which we're delighted to do in partnership with Symposium Books. So we've been calling this the WaterFire Symposium. And as I announced last week, in following Platonic rules, the definition of a symposium is a conversation over wine. So the wine is over there, and we actually don't need to wait to the end of the conversation to have wine. If you wanted to be enjoying the book over wine, it is there. It is free. There's a place to make a contribution if you wish. I'm going to introduce John, but we're really delighted to have Marjan Kamali here tonight to read from her book. And I just learned the paperback edition came out Tuesday. So you were first of the nation. So there we are.
Good evening. I'm John Soski. I'm the event coordinator at Symposium Books. One of the great joys of working in a bookstore is the book recommendations you receive, but you also on occasion get people who are quite frustrated with you for not having their favorite book, which in many cases can be quite obscure and strange. So I think it was in my first 2 weeks working in Symposium that a very smart young woman came in and asked me if I had a copy of the stationery shop, and when I said no, she let me know in no uncertain terms that the bookstore did not live up to her standards, and that I should look at the book immediately. So I asked her what it was about, and she started to tell me a bewitching story about a novel regarding the 1953 coup against Mossadegh in Iran, and then ended her pitch for the book by telling me it was by her mother. So. So I went and read a review and was swept up by the reviews I read. And since that point in time, I have written down every book somebody's recommended that I read at Symposium and at least read a review of it. So I will say this is the kind of novel that when you read, you want to hold the person you love close. It is a poignant novel of loss, and it's a novel of personal loss, but it's also a novel of great historical loss. We have stereotypes about what a romance is, a kind of harlequin light book that are, of course, very gendered stereotypes. And we have stereotypes about what a historical novel is, which is a thick, dusty tome that lies on your bedside that you never quite get through. This is a genre-bending book that defies both stereotypes by bringing romance and history together. In the WaterFire Symposium, our goal is to bring authors, philosophers, scientists, journalists to talk about some of the most pressing issues of our time. Of course, love and loss are always pressing issues, but also in this case, there has been no time that it is more important for Americans to understand the long, difficult, complex relationship between America and Iran, and particularly America's role in the 1953 coup against the Mossadegh government. And this is a book that makes the cost of that coup hauntingly and humanly poignant. So please join me in welcoming Marjan Kamali, who we have the pleasure of hearing read tonight.
Thank you so much for that introduction. And thank you for having me here at the WaterFire Symposium. It's an honor to be here tonight. I will be honest with you, and I will say the fact that my standing here before you is due to my daughter makes this my absolute favorite event that I've done for this book, and I've done many. This will remain in my heart as the most special one. I can just imagine the way she told you that. Just imagine her voice. I texted her when you told me earlier, and there was a lot of OMG, OMG, OMG. Yes, I did that. Yes. So, thank you for having me. The stationery shop came out in hardcover in June, and the paperback came out yesterday, so it's very exciting. This is a love story. It's a love story about two teenagers who meet when they're 17 in 1953 in Tehran in a stationery shop. They fall madly in love, as one can only fall so intensely when one is young. One of my favorite quotes, which is an epigraph to the book, is, "They slipped briskly into an intimacy from which they never recovered." That's an F. Scott Fitzgerald quote from This Side of Paradise, and I love that quote. And the second epigraph is by President Harry Truman. "There is nothing new in the world except the history you do not know." And both those epigraphs informed me as I wrote this book, because I was obsessed with this love story. I was obsessed with the emotional impact of loss. I was also obsessed, I'll be truthful, with Iran. It's a country where I've spent very few years of my life. I lived there as a child for a few years, and I visited as an adult several times. It's a country that informs so much of my cultural joy. I never am as happy as when I'm eating Persian food. And it's a country that my parents constantly felt like they had to explain to me, only because it'd be one thing if there was no news about Iran, and then they could give me their version, but there's always news about Iran. And the news about Iran feels strangely one tone, and, it's as though the entire country and the history between the US and Iran is, I don't want to say whitewashed, because that's not the right word. It's just it's just very broad strokes of something that is so nuanced, so detailed, so rich. I felt that there was a lot I needed to learn. So my generation is the generation that was shaped by the 1979 revolution in Iran, which a lot of you may be familiar with. It was the event that cleaved my life into before and after. There was life before, and then there was life after. And like many Iranian Americans of my generation, I was obsessed with this one event. And my first book, Together Tea, had as its backdrop the Iranian Revolution of '79 and the ensuing Iran-Iraq War. And I could draw on my own experiences to a degree, because even though I didn't live in Iran for a long time, I did live there during the start of the Iran-Iraq War. And you could say that that helped shape me as a writer more than anything. Some of you in the room may have memories of that war, and we were often woken up in the middle of the night to loud sirens, and we had to go down to the basement. I see the nods. I know, I can always tell who has had this traumatic experience. And we were in, the basement, and my mom, in order to distract us, would stock the basement with snacks and books. And English language books were particularly important to my sister, because we had come to Iran from overseas, and my sister was obsessed that I not forget my English. So I read a lot of Jane Eyre, and I read a lot of Charles Dickens down there. I read what my mother had, which were not necessarily age-appropriate books, but we didn't have YA back then, or middle grade would have been more appropriate. But in any case, I read those classics. And I was stunned by what those authors could do, because they were able to take me out of my world, and they were able to transport me to another time and another place. And I remember thinking, that is a superpower. That is a superpower that I wish I had. And when my family moved to the US, I wanted to be a writer. But as the child of immigrants, I was encouraged to become a doctor. So I was pre-med for 2 weeks. That was fun. And then I was pre-law. I applied to law school. And in my personal statement, I wrote about how much I wanted to be a writer, creative writer. So I think they were on to me. And then finally, the compromise was, okay, you're not going to be an engineer. So I went to business school. And I was sitting there getting an MBA in Columbia Business School. It was a position of privilege. I'm not mocking it, but I just wanted to be in the building across the way. The building across the way happened to be the MFA building, the creative writing building. But those of us who had a background in the liberal arts were required to do what was called math camp to come up to speed on calculus and all that stuff. So I was in a class where the professor was teaching us Excel and how to use it to find the bottom line of a company. And I started to daydream about how you could use spreadsheets for a bunch of other things. And I started to think, what if an Iranian mother used spreadsheets to find a formula to find the perfect suitor for her daughter? It was on my mind at the time for a variety of reasons. So I started to write that story, and then that story became the first chapter of my first novel, Together Tea. So it was a long and winding road to becoming a novelist. But after the first book came out and it was translated into several languages, and it was this amazing dream come true experience, I remember being asked, so are you going to be a one-trick pony? And then I realized, oh, I see, so I have to do this again. And in thinking about the topic for the second book, I realized I'd gotten to a degree out of my system, my fixation with 1979. But whenever I brought up 1979, my parents and their generation would say, oh, well, you don't know anything about 1953. That's when it all began. And I realized I didn't know much about 1953. I just knew the coup happened in 53. I knew the US and the UK had a role in it. For years, that was denied, but by the time I started to write this book, it was out in the open. And then I visited a book club for the first book, and there was a woman who came to me at the end, and she asked if I would visit where she works. She said she works at an assisted living center, and I said, sure. And then I went down there to Duxbury, Massachusetts a few weeks later, and as I was reading, there was an elderly gentleman in a wheelchair, and he kept saying things. And I wasn't sure if he was heckling me or if he was cheering me on, but he kept going on and on. And then they had organized this wonderful Persian lunch. There's a lot of food in both my books, which means I get fed well at a lot of book events. So we were sitting down to this lunch, and the elderly man wheeled himself over, and he kept saying things. He kept saying things like, I met the Prince of Spain, I traveled with Charles de Gaulle, and he kept going on, and then the people at the table kind of dismissed him. They wanted him to leave me alone. They even said, leave the author alone. But I just asked him his name. And then when I went home for Thanksgiving and my father asked me how the book events were going, I mentioned this one man because he had an Iranian name. And my father thinks he knows every Iranian American of a certain generation. So I mentioned his name, and my dad said, oh, he was one of our most decorated dignitaries. He met the Prince of Spain. He traveled with Charles de Gaulle. He did all these things. And I realized, I Googled him, and I realized that everything that gentleman had been saying was true. And I remember just sitting there at my parents' dining room table stunned, and I kept thinking, what does it take to be an elderly person in an assisted living center with this past that nobody believes? Or they believe it and they just don't care. And I started with that image of a man in a wheelchair in an assisted living center, and I made it the Duxton Senior Center, which is my clever disguise for Duxbury. And I had 1953 on my mind, so I started to think of two young lovers who meet in 1953 and are then separated on the day of the coup, and then they get reunited 60 years later. So it was a long process to write this book. It was arduous. There was a lot of crying involved. I had good friends who supported me, like the wonderful writer Maria Much, who's here tonight, and who said, you know, everything you're going through, it's just going to make the book better. And I pretended I believed her. But she was right. The long, kind of lonely process forced me to revise the book and not listen to the outside voices and not listen to anybody in publishing and write the truest book I thought I could write. Just trusting that whatever emotional pain I was going through might actually also translate to help the reader. And it ended up being a very healing process. This book for me was very healing. I came out of it at the risk of sounding a little melodramatic, but I came out of it a different person than I was when I started it. So I did a lot of research about 1953. I read nonfiction accounts. I was in a position where I could interview people who had lived through it, so I did my best. Many people did not wish to talk to me. They didn't want to talk about 1953, and a lot of my relatives just couldn't understand why I don't write about Australia. They're like, just write about Australia. Enough with Iran. But a few opened up, and those conversations were really edifying and really transforming. And one person who opened up the most was actually my father. And his age mirrors the age of Bahman, the hero of the book. He is not Bahman, but he helped me with a lot of period details, and he shared with me what Tehran looked like at the time, what people were eating in the cafes, what music they were listening to, what they were wearing, what was playing at Cinema Metropole, all kinds of details that I felt, really helped me build a world to the best of my ability that reflected a version of 1953 that could be real. And he even went into great detail about street names. And I remember telling him, no one's going to care about the street names. He's like, no, you have to get it right. So then when the book went to copy edit with Simon & Schuster, the copy editor came back and she said things like, you said Hafez Street, but it was actually Hafez Avenue. So they really checked. And he was right, people do care. So it's been an incredible journey to think of the hours spent alone in a room writing in the dark, and I mean the dark. I pull down the shades, I close the door. It's a very internal process, and the hours of research. And then to get the reactions from readers, which is something you don't necessarily think about when you're writing a book. But the story of lost love is also a story of a lost country, and I think you really hit that on the head, which is, this loss of a first love for a lot of that generation. It was also a loss of innocence, in idealism, in activism, in a future that they believed was going to be quite bright, and a lot of that changed. So I get messages from people all over the world now, and it's incredibly moving. Things like, because of reading your book, I'm now going to write to JP. So I hope I'm not breaking up marriages, is what I'm hoping, because people are contacting their first loves. But yeah, you'd be surprised what people share with authors. Sometimes I feel a bit guilty. Okay, so I would like to read for you a little bit from the stationery shop, just to give you a taste. And I'm not reading from the first chapter. Sometimes I read from the first chapter, and that's easy because I don't have to say anything because you don't need to know anything because we just pick up the book and read the first page. But I'm reading from the second chapter. The first chapter starts in 2013 when Roya and Bahman are 77, and we are in Duxton, Massachusetts. And Roya, after 60 years, I'm not giving anything away, this is in the first chapter, has found Bahman, who was her fiancé back in 1953, and she decides to go see him for the first time in 60 years because there is some unfinished business between them, lots of questions left unanswered that she has decided to finally maybe get to the bottom of. And they meet when they're 77 in the very first chapter. And then we go back in time to when they meet for the first time, which is in 1953 when they're 17. And it's a time when Tehran is blossoming with sort of a new theater scene and film and publishing, but it's also very politically divided. There's a strong communist movement in the country. There is the National Front, which is Prime Minister Mossadegh's movement, and then there's, the camp of monarchists who are very much behind the young Shah at that time. The Shah that we all think of was quite young, and lots of demonstrations going on in the streets. So I think that's all you really need to know for this scene, and I will just read. Okay. Boys had no trouble finding their way from their own schools to the girls' school to linger by the gates at dismissal time. Abbas shouted and shooed them away. "You sons of dogs," he yelled, "leave these girls alone, you'll burn in hell." Roya ignored the boys who followed them home, but Zari, her sister, made sure the good-looking one saw her twirl her thick dark hair, especially if Yusuf was in the mix. Some days the boys appeared at every street corner, round every bend. Slick, sly, clever boys who winked and whistled and flirted. Handsome, smart boys with charming smiles. Quiet, shy boys who sneaked an occasional glance at them, then reddened when caught. Roya got used to them the way one gets used to annoying flies, which means she never got used to them. Roya's favorite place in all of Tehran was the stationery shop. It was on the corner of Churchill Street and Hafez Avenue, opposite the Russian embassy and right across the street from her school. Roya loved running her fingers over tablets of smooth pages in that shop. She loved the boxes of pencils that smelled like lead and promised knowledge. She could spend an entire afternoon just looking at fountain pens and ink bottles or flipping through books that spoke of poetry and love and loss. The shop was simply called the stationery shop, no fancy name to it, but it was a bookstore as much as a stationery store. As the political divisions deepened that winter and hot-headed people engaged in debates and demonstrations all over the streets, it was the perfect retreat of quiet and learning. It was a sanctuary of calm, never overlit, never loud. One particularly windy day in January, when Roya wanted to escape the communist demonstration gathering momentum in the street, she slipped into the shop. She just wanted to read some poetry. "Rumi today?" Mr. Fakhri asked from behind the counter. He was a calm, kind man in his 50s, with salt and pepper hair, a bushy mustache, and round wire spectacles. Mr. Fakhri's shoes were always freshly polished. He had owned the shop for as long as Roya could remember, and he was an expert on books. Mr. Fakhri kept the shelf stocked with Persian classics and poetry and translations of literature from all over the world. "Yes, please." Roya had come here so often that Mr. Fakhri knew her reading taste well. He knew that Roya loved ancient Persian poetry but couldn't stand some of the modern short stories. He knew that she would spend the very last of her allowance on a brand new tablet of paper, and that her favorite stationery products were those imported from Germany because they were the most colorful and modern. He also knew that every now and then, in silence, she scribbled words of her own on the tablets she bought from him. Mr. Fakhri knew all these things, and it was his non-judgmental calm that led her into his shop as much as the piles of pristine books and pencils and paper tablets. Here you go. The Rumi poetry book he handed her was printed on shiny new paper and had a dark green cover with gold lettering. Some of his best between these covers. Make sure you find yourself a quiet spot and don't let anyone disturb you. He takes some concentrating if you really want to get to the truth of it. Roya was reaching into her purse when the bell above the shop door chimed. The door burst open, letting in shouts from the streets and a huge gust of wind. The pages of poetry ruffled in her hand. A boy her age entered the store in a hurry. He had on a white collared shirt and dark pants. His hair was a thick black mop, his cheeks red from the wind. He walked in whistling a tune that was wistful and filled with longing. It was unlike anything she had heard and completely out of place with his stride and confident look. Mr. Fakhri jumped to attention and moved fast. He dove behind the counter, grabbed a pile of papers, bundled them with string, and handed them over to the boy as though he'd been waiting for this special guest all day. The boy stopped whistling, dug into his pockets, and paid. It was a quick, urgent, wordless transaction. The boy was almost out the door when he turned. She thought he'd say thank you to Mr. Fakhri, but he looked right at her. His eyes were joyful and filled with hope. "I am fortunate to meet you," he said. Then he strode out of the store and into the wind. Mr. Fakhri and Roya stood silently as the store settled back to normal after the effect of the boy's presence, as though they had ridden a hot air balloon that was only now landing and deflating. "Who was that?" Roya asked, feeling, for no reason at all, charged. It was disorienting and confusing to have this excitement surge through her just from the boy's brief visit. "That, my dear girl," Mr. Fakhri said, "is Bahman Aslan." A look of concern crossed his face. He drummed his fingers on the counter. "That is the boy who wants to change the world." Roya carefully placed her Rumi book into her satchel. She stared at the doorway. She felt slightly infected, as though she had witnessed something overpowering and surprising, but also deeply personal, something of the inevitable beat of hope and life and energy. She said goodbye to Mr. Fakhri in a daze. Okay, and I'm going to stop there, but needless to say, Roya and Bahman meet again in the stationery shop several times. That's where they fall in love, against the bookshelves and in sort of the dusty quietness of the shop. Mr. Fakhri is sort of a willing ally in their romance. And then there's Bahman's mother, who those of you who've read the book may have had some issues with. And then there is all the politics that's building and building and building and culminates in the coup. And they are separated. And eventually Roya resigns herself and she moves to California for college, where she meets Walter and she marries him. And she has a life in New England and a family until 60 years later she gets to go to the Duxton Senior Center and see Bahman again and ask him the questions that have haunted her for 6 decades. So I would like to now open it up to Q&A. If any of you have any questions about the writing process or stationery shops, I am an expert on stationery shops, or anything. just about anything. I've learned not to say anything.
I know a little bit about your mother, and I'd love to know what your mom and your dad think of this book.
Yes. So I consider myself at this stage pretty much an American parent because I praise my children all the time. I keep saying, good job, you're so great, you did this, you did that, wonderful. Just the texting alone just now. You recommended my book, good job. So my parents don't do that as much. And when my first book came out, they were very proud, very, very proud. But then, in a quiet way. But then when I told my mother that this book was coming out, she said, oh, that's really good, because now you're an author. And then I said, well, I was an author before, because I have a book out. And she said, no, anyone can write one book. Now you've got two. So those are the standards that I have back home, which is great, trust me, because when I do get praised, I know I really did a good job. So it's good. Yes, and behind Maria, you had a question.
Please tell me that you did go back to visit the gentleman
So before I could go back, he came to me because I did another reading in Kingston, and I looked up and he was being wheeled in. So he became a bit of a groupie. He became a fan. But then when I was finally in the stages where I knew what I was writing about and I wanted to let him know that he provided the kernel of inspiration, he passed away. So that was quite sad. But the Duxbury Senior Center, the real Duxbury Senior Center, caught on to the inspiration part of this story, and they invited me to read from the stationery shop. So in October, I went down to Duxbury, Mass, and I read from the book, and I read in the same hall I read in the same time, the last time, but he wasn't there. But, his friends were there, and I read the scene, and I said, this is here, And then I told them that they had to provide me for the inspiration of the third book. And we had another lovely Persian lunch. So that part was very rewarding, but he did pass away. When I met him, he was quite old. So, yeah. And you had a question, yeah?
It honestly just came from your prompt to us, I guess, that last about questions about stationery shops. And I was like, yeah, that is interesting. I have little experience, but I remember I studied abroad in Italy, and there were many shops and bookshops, and they became quite magical spaces, I think, for people. So I'd be curious. You say you know a lot about them. So just any commentary, or now it sort of sparked my interest in the magic of the space itself, in which the characters have fallen in love.
I do think it's a magical space, and when I was a child, I loved stationery shops. I still do, the ones that remain, and I don't mean Staples or what are those things. I mean like the small stationery shops. And in Iran, a lot of times, stationery shops are also bookshops. Though now I've noticed our independent bookstores also sell a lot of stationery and all kinds of gifts. When I visit a new town, sometimes people visit a new town and they make it a point to go to like a special coffee shop or to check out the pub. I see if it has a stationery shop. So even when I was in Wyoming this summer, I was in Jackson and I found the stationery shop and I was so excited. I love stationery shops. And then there's a local stationery shop near me and I try to frequent it to support them. And I told the owner that I'm writing a book called The Stationery Shop, and it's set in a stationery shop, and I went on, and he really couldn't care less. He really could not care less. So, but I think they're very magical spaces. I think it's also because I really love writing implements. I love them. Like, I write longhand a lot, which I know is a dying practice, but I highly, highly recommend it. It's very therapeutic. So I really do take pens seriously. I really do. And I just think, I love everything to do with writing, even the equipment. Yes.
Hi, so it's an absolutely stunning cover.
Hmm.
And I'm just wondering if you had any inspiration for the cover, how much input you had into the cover, did you have a lot of say in what the final product looked like?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I get a lot of compliments on the cover. So this is the hardcover cover, which a lot of people love. And then there's the paperback cover, which is my new love, quite frankly, as of yesterday, is my new love. They pretend I have say, but I don't really. So what happens is, I mean, it might be different for every writer, but for me, they email me the image, and they say, what do you think? And then I give my feedback, and they kind of ignore it. But in this case, this wasn't the original cover. They sent an image. It was a pale green background with an envelope and a hand holding the envelope. It was very bland, and I thought it was bland. More importantly, my agent thought it was bland, and more importantly, the head of sales at the publishers thought it was bland. So they went back to the drawing table and they came up with this, which I truly love this. And then I became like a baby, and I was attached to this. And then when they said the paperback will have a different cover, I resisted. And they said, no, just trust us. But I did have a say, because I did chime in on like the silhouettes that you see on the paperback cover. And especially when anything is cultural, they do listen to me. Like the UK cover, they had a woman walking into a kind of very Middle Eastern-y scene wearing a headscarf and jeans and a tunic. No, that was the original, her outfit. And I said, no, that would be post-1979. So then they changed it to the dress that you see on the UK cover now, which is more what she would have worn in '53. Yeah, the title was different. So in the UK and Australia and New Zealand, it's called The Stationery Shop of Tehran. And they said that they felt that for those markets, they wanted the place. So I guess I do have more of a say than I'm giving, than I'm pretending I do. But the art director, if it's a good art director, if he or she is very good at what they do, they read the book, and then they make a cover to reflect the emotional tone of the book. Yeah, I feel very lucky to have these covers. Noticed a beautiful poster in Symposium Books this evening. Beautiful, yeah.
Were there any additional questions you would have wanted to go back as time has gone on? You had the opportunity to go back and speak with this gentleman, but as your relationship has continued to go on in your imagination and time has gone on, are there any additional questions?
That's such a good question. I do think about him a lot. I really do. I want to also maintain the line between fact and fiction. So he was a real figure with a very strong and accomplished past. And then my one interaction with him inspired this image. But then that image morphed into Bahman. So then in my mind, there are two separate beings. So were he still alive, if I were to talk to him, I wouldn't really talk to him about my character, because at this point, my character is just as real to me. And even though I made him up, but I would want to keep them separate. it would be too muddying to even discuss with him. That's a great question, though.
Have there been what are the differences in response abroad versus here in the States? And I guess you're basically, one side would perhaps read it with a lot of real life memories, the other one might just perceive it as almost like a historical novel. So just curious what the differences are.
So one of the differences, a lot of times with American readers, the response I get is, I learned so much, and I didn't know about this event, I didn't know about this period. With Iranian readers of a certain generation, I remembered so much. You know, you brought it back to life, and that's also immensely rewarding to me, because they say, you know, I could identify with the characters and with a lot of the emotions that were rampant at that time. So, yeah, I get that. With younger Iranian American readers, I get the same reaction as American readers. You know, they say, oh, I didn't know. So, yeah.
Is the book translated into Farsi?
Mm-hmm. It's being translated into several languages, and with Farsi, there's always a problem because I'm not allowed to say yes to the translators who contact me. And the reason I'm not allowed is because my agent is worried about the sanctions, so we're not allowed to officially approve of a business transaction. So it's heartbreaking, but for all I know, it's been translated. So many of English language books are translated there in any case. But it is being translated into Turkish and a few other languages, Polish and Norwegian. And yeah, it's hard for me because I would love for it to be translated into Farsi. I don't think it would be banned. I don't think so, no.
There are many Persian love poets you could have put at the center of this story, and you chose Rumi. Can you talk about that?
You know, I'm not a very good scholar of the ancient Persian poets. It's one of my father's biggest regrets is that I haven't read them all in Farsi. Like, he really would like for me to have done that. And I did try when I was in high school and college, but I picked Rumi for two reasons. One, I do feel that his love poems are incredibly powerful, even though they're short. And they just have this universal appeal. And two, there's an accessibility to him where you say the name, and this could be good or bad because it's almost become a cliche, but you say the name and there's a recognition of him. So it was shorthand, it was easier to sort of use his poems. But my God, the readers sometimes write to me and then they ask me to analyze why I included a certain poem when I did. And then I have to, you know, think about that and answer. So my goal is to get good enough to read him in Farsi, but that's a long-term goal. Retirement, maybe. Do we have other questions, or? Yes?
I wonder, in 1953, if you went to school in the United States, you might very well have had an inkwell. And you probably learned to write a letter.
Yeah.
And you learned to write a word, and then you learned to write a sentence, and then you learned to write an essay. Now you've mentioned your own children texting. Where are writers going to come from, and where's that skill? I think that skill is being lost a little bit in the ability to write.
Yeah, I mean, the medium's different, but, you know, I learned with an inkwell. When I was in fourth grade in Iran, we literally had inkwells on our desks and calligraphy pens. So that was just like a given. Calligraphy was taught. But my children, my daughter is 3 years older than my son, and she learned cursive in elementary school, and my son did not. Just within 3 years, they changed the curriculum. The future writers are still coming up because these guys are reading. They're reading a lot, actually, but they're just not physically writing using the same instruments we used. But they are writing. I have noticed that they're writing, and you could argue that some of the new media is quite creative. You could even argue that tweets are creative. They force you to condense your thoughts. I know, given our favorite tweeter, that's maybe hard to stomach, but a lot of writers like to get creative when they tweet. So, but the medium is changing. My son hardly ever writes by hand, ever. It's startling, like maybe a grocery list. Yes.
What's next?
Ah, yes, what's next? So I've learned there's always a next. And I think this book was so incredibly emotional for me that after it came out, I needed a good year to just take a breath. But the third book, I did start it, and it also is going to take place in contemporary US and Iran. I would love to get to the stage in my life where I do write about Australia and make my relatives happy, but there's still a lot maybe for my own edification that I need to work through. So I won't get into it too much because I keep explaining it, and then my husband said, stop telling everybody what your book's about. Just write the book. There's this whole theory about you shouldn't talk about it. So tonight I'll take that and I'll just say I have a deadline, and it's Friday for certain pages. So we'll see what happens. Okay, well, if there are no more questions, I just want to thank you for coming out tonight. I truly appreciate it. This will go down as truly my favorite event because Mona made it happen. That just tickles me as a mother. So thank you for coming, and I'm truly loving Providence. Had the best bibimbap ever across the street from your bookshop today. So thanks, everybody, and hope you have a great Valentine's Day.
Thank you so much, Marjan. That was wonderful. The book is here for sale. As we said, the paperback came out yesterday. Please come back for the rest of the listings are out by the table. I didn't bring it with us. John, thank you so much. It was such a great, eloquent introduction. And Scott is here. I want Scott from Symposium is our other partner in this project. Thank you, Scott. Thank you all so much for coming, and please join us for the symposium part.